Okay. So we have the chat box. So the chat box is there, and you could definitely put questions as you're thinking of them. Otherwise, we will definitely have questions after each article, and there are questions posed. We will have to unmute you with this new webinar system we're using. It's just the way it is that we have to unmute everybody. So during the question periods, we will unmute people as you raise your hand that you want to talk or you write in the chat box. I think that's about it about the muting, which has definitely been confusing. Once you raise your hand or put something in the chat box, we will know to unmute you so everybody could hear you. It is important that we mute everybody because of background noise. And the last thing I want to say is the webinar will be recorded. We upload these on the faculty development website through the Hofstra-Northwell School of Medicine, and they're archived, but no CME credit is granted, but certainly the access to the actual webinar is available. And the reason we have everybody muted also is please do not put your phone on hold during this. If you need to do something, leave the program and then come back. It's very distracting to hear music that nobody could hear the speaker. So that's a big plea of no hold of the Northwell phones hearing music. So I think we'll start. David's ready to go. If anybody has a question right now, you should raise your hand in that area. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everybody. This is David Marcus. I see a lot of some familiar names on the board, but for people who I haven't met, I am the residency director for the combined program in emergency medicine and internal medicine at LIJ, and that's pretty much it for me, I guess. So we should get started. By the end of today's session, I think you had some of this in advance. Hopefully we'll be talking about, or we'll help everybody be able to understand, describe the concepts of circadian desynchronization and shift lag. We'll be talking about some tools for mitigating risks of sleep deprivation, and be able to hopefully compare what our current scheduling practices are and what we can do to help perhaps mitigate or reduce these risks for our trainees and even for our own partners. So we all know that sleep deprivation is bad, and we know that the long work hours are dangerous. This is not news to anybody, I'm assuming. The data about being up for 24 to 36 hours being equivalent to essentially being drunk, with all that comes with that, considering your trainees driving home. I mean, I remember when I was a resident, I lived at housing in LIJ, and I heard a bang outside, and I saw one of the PEDS ICU fellows who I knew drove straight into a pole because she was coming off some kind of 30-hour shift, and she basically passed out the wheel. She wasn't hurt. There was minimal damage to the car, but just to highlight, these things do happen, and I'm sure you've all heard had your own experiences in some way. Other things that correlate with badness, I guess 48 hours per week has been shown to correlate actually with emotional disturbances. Over than 60 hours a week, we think there's some kind of association with cardiovascular risk. So, the risk to ourselves, the risk to our trainees is actually real. Longer shifts, so when they look at, and this is data that wasn't provided necessarily within the readings, but just for background sake, looking at shifts of 9 hours versus shifts of 12 to 14 to 36 hours, 24 hours, the longer your shifts, the more unhealthier diets are going to be, and the more at risk you are for unhealthy or maladaptive coping strategies, including smoking, caffeine abuse, alcohol abuse, and other substances, of course. The odds ratio, by the way, after a 36-hour shift is 5.9. 24-hour shift is 2.3 for getting into a motor vehicle accident. Not just talking about ourselves, of course, but thinking about our patients, which probably is the crux of what we do, all about our patients. So there's plenty of patient safety data. Talked about, again, the intoxication. There is proven reduction in our judgment or impairment of our judgment, clinical judgment, our manual skills, dexterity. They've studied this with IVs, with suturing, with just errors and kind of ability to deal with medical crises, and they've shown over and over again that these things link to badness. The final thing regarding sleeplessness or sleep deprivation or the shift lag that we're talking about is the lack of insight. It's interesting, we were just talking just now at our resident conference with Tracy Sanson, who's a national leader in emergency medicine, talking about risk. And she was also quoting the same data, essentially, that shows that we as physicians, as medical providers of all different types, don't actually have much insight into our errors and into our impairment due to sleep deprivation. We are making mistakes and we think we're not making them. When they talk to pilots, when they talk to other very high reliability industries, they find these people, 97, 80, 100% of them know that they're impaired after a certain amount of time. We as doctors, for some reason, are in denial. So our current approach to this, of course, has been, and this is something that Alice brought to my attention, is to teach our residents how to cope. And so within the health system, there's been some use of the SAFER curriculum. I'm not sure if SAFER is required or to what degree the programs participate in it. If anybody has any thoughts about this, you're welcome to comment so we can bring it up now. But what we do and what the SAFER curriculum is, it's a national curriculum that basically talks about how residents can cope. So first off, teaches awareness of the problems that come with sleep deprivation and shift issues, and then teaching residents how to cope, how to prevent errors, how to deal with their own impairment, shall we say. What it doesn't do, though, and what we haven't done as a system, I think, well enough yet, is talk about, well, what are the systems issues and how can we help? So we're trying to lead our trainees to kind of solve their own problems, but we're kind of putting them in a very difficult situation where we're forcing them to work hours or schedules that really are not conducive to their wellness and not conducive to patient safety. So the key question is, how can we modify our scheduling practices to support well-being? These are the 3 articles that were sent to you. The first one is a recent study. It's one example. As I said, it's very recent. It came out in March of 2017. There's actually several other similar papers that have come out over the last year or two since the work hours changed in 2011 to stop interns from working 24 hours. We shortened their work days and all this. So they were looking at the impact that work hour change had on conference attendings and their sleep and the number of patients seen. The next 2 articles are actually reviews, one more out of the Air Force or airline safety or pilot, flight safety industry, and the last one out of emergency medicine. So the first paper, shift schedules, internal work hours. So what they did here, or what the question I have here for this is, how has the move from a traditional call schedule to shift-based scheduling impacted sleep patterns and resident education? What they've done, give me 1 second please, this is a technical issue. What they did basically is that this was in a children's hospital. They have 23, 29 interns per year. This is a study done just on the interns, was my understanding from the reading of the paper. It was prospective. I call it a pseudo crossover because this was a 4-month study where they switched, where they cycled through the schedule. So the first month they did, for example, the traditional Q4 call schedule, meaning the fourth day is a 24-hour day with a post-call day, versus a day and night float system. They alternated months, and my presumption is that many of the residents were the same, but they didn't really discuss how many residents cycled in and out. So that's one part that I'm not really sure about. They didn't describe adequately, I think. The data they collected were paper surveys, so self-reporting of the work hours and the number of patients seen. Sleep logs, again, self-reported by the residents. They didn't use any fancy devices here, just whatever the residents put down. And then conference attendance, which was tracked by their a software system that they purchased. So almost all the interns participated. They got a very high percentage participation rate. And they were controlling also because, you might think it might be different depending on how busy the service is. They did control for whether or not they were at high versus low census months. So these are the results. Initially, for the traditional schedule, they found the residents worked just over 79 hours a week. They saw during the high census months, took care of just about 6.2 patients. They attended about a third or 3 out of 10 conferences. This is morning report and noon conference was almost the same for this group. And they slept about 6.3 hours a night. And considering that the recommendation is about 7 hours a night, I guess it's not horrible, but it's not optimal. But what they did find also was a very irregular sleep pattern. The day shift folks worked less. This was statistically significant, 73 hours. I think that was actually not significant. It trended towards towards a change, I should say. They saw a few more patients, so about 8 patients during the day. They did not attend their morning conferences during the busy periods. They did attend about a third of their conferences during the less busy periods. The noon conference attendance was about the same. And they slept about 6.8 hours a night, which did not reach significance, but seemed to be a little more than the traditional schedule. The night shift folks worked less, and this did reach significance compared to the traditional 71 hours. They didn't report the patient numbers. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because their coverage system is different than what they do during the day. Conference attendance, of course, for night shifts is 0 because they're just not there for a morning report generally and not there for the conference. And then they slept 7.2 hours, which did reach statistical significance, so more than the traditional schedule, and regular. But they say, like I said, the striking thing about the night float folks was this irregularity. You could definitely see on this chart here, they're showing basically on day 2, the night float, the Q4 rather, I'm sorry, the Q4 folks on their second night obviously have very little sleep to no sleep, and then they have this bolus of sleep on day 3, and then day 4 they kind of resume a normal. So this, I think, can't be healthy. There's some data about that, but compared to the other schedules, which do give more reliable and more consistent sleep. So some limitations. This is a single residency program, modest sample size, possibility of interns misreporting, and it may not be generalizable. So do you have any comments? I'd like to hear your thoughts of anybody who, whether you think this correlates to your experience, is this relevant or irrelevant, any other thoughts about this? Because again, they're trying to see the impact on education. A lot of this, some of the critiques, people I guess thought that if we shorten the work hours or change the work hours, we may be able to allow more protected time or better education. Another argument that people have against limiting the work hours is that the residents potentially would see fewer patients. Another critique of the shortened work hours is the increased handoffs, which we can talk about a little bit later. So does this correlate to anything? Would anybody like to comment? All right. Well, that's okay, if not. But, I think at least from this paper, what it seems, the conclusion I was able to draw from it at least, is it seems that the, night float versus day float or day schedule, the shift-based system, they do seem to see equivalent amounts of patients, maybe more patients, so there's definitely an experiential learning component, but it seems to impact the conference attendance, and it may be that there's more stress on the residents. I think I've seen that from at least our residents and the residents I've worked with over the last few years with these changes. Overall, they do seem to be more days in the hospital. They seem to be more stressed about things and maybe less likely to attend conference. That I don't know. But these results do correlate to some other papers I was looking at in preparing this talk.
Go ahead, Wendy.
So with the bibliometrics for this article, seeing as it was just published in March of 2017, there were actually no metrics recorded for either Scopus or altmetrics. So that doesn't really necessarily mean that no one's really talking about it. It just means that it's a very new article. So it's understandable that perhaps the chatter might come in later in the year, more so than right this minute.
Okay, so to transition to our second paper, this comes from the flight industry, talking mostly about pilots. I think primarily in the Air Force is where these folks are from, Air Force and industry. So how can the individual mitigate the risks? And again, this is something that we do talk about to a certain extent, I think. We talk about in emergency medicine because we are a shift-based specialty, but I know other specialties also deal with this because the shifts come in everywhere. In general, adults should sleep, we think, about 8 hours a night. The average American gets less than 7 hours a night. And if you restrict to less than 6, you start accumulating what's called a sleep debt, which results in increased sleep pressure or impaired function and just overall sensation of fatigue. I can sympathize with that. I'm sure most of you probably can. We do this to ourselves to a certain extent, but also, how much of this are we doing to our residents when we might be able to avoid it? So the human circadian cycle is actually a little bit longer than 24 hours. It's really something around 25 hours, and I'm sure a lot of people know this already, and it's one of the reasons it's easier to transition to a longer day and to move forward, so from a day shift to an evening to a night shift, as opposed to moving from a night to an evening to a day, which wreaks more havoc physiologically. In terms of some physiologic parameters, which again I'm sure people are familiar with, in the day blood pressure tends to be higher, as does the heart rate, as does the temperature. At night, and as a person who works a lot of nights, I can testify, blood pressure, heart rate, and temperature drop. There's actually a dip of temperature around 3 to 4 a.m., which corresponds to the cortisol dip, I should say. So, the physiology is just different. So to expect people to be able to behave the same they do during the day as they do at night is obviously irrational. The shift lag comes in when you get dysynchrony. So if basically these things are entrained. So there's zeit givers, right? The things that give us the time during the day are the sun, possibly heat, other things that happen during the day, the noise, etc. And the things at night that give us the night sensation is the dark. We see the stars and sometimes the moon is quieter, more calm. So these things give us night externally. So when those external factors don't line up with our internal physiologic factors, we can run into this shift lag, which is very similar to jet lag. So our body wants to sleep when we're supposed to be awake. Why would anybody really want to be in the hospital at 2 a.m. and doing stuff, right? But we need to be there. That's the reality. So to predict whether or not our schedule or the way we work ourselves is going to be a problem and will cause fatigue, you have to consider 3 things, essentially, per this article: the circadian mechanisms, which are the things we were just talking about, the cortisol levels and everything else that fluctuates in a predictable way in the body, the homeostatic mechanism, so how long has it been since I last slept, how much have I been sleeping lately, did I just nap, and then sleep inertia. Sleep inertia is this thing that happens when you wake up and you feel woozy and you can't really function. This is a real entity, and depending on the time of day and how long you've been deprived before and how long you've napped for, sleep inertia can be a really big thing and actually can lead to significant impairment. So when we think about napping on the job, we also have to think about sleep inertia, and we can talk a little bit about that a little bit later. So towards finding a solution, the thing is there are people who just do better at night. That's physiologically true, and this has come up over and over again in these behavioral studies they've done on folks. And when they sleep deprive them, and they do some really inhumane things to study participants, they allow them, 2 hours of sleep once a night, or naps, or etc. All these different weird schedules. Some people just do fine, and they don't really impair, and their function is okay, and they probably just have an easier time for whatever reason switching. Some people are a little bit better with nights than they are with days. So that is an actual thing. It's an actual scientific, physiologic thing. You can't predict it, but when somebody finds that they're good at nights, they're probably going to stay good at nights in general, as long as they have other criteria met. This, by the way, just reminds me of sailing. I don't know if anybody sails. There's people who do the solo sailing around the world. And, that's days and days and days, or months, really, of barely any sleep. So these folks, if you read their journals and their logs, they'll sleep for 30 minutes at a time, several times a day, or at most an hour if they can, because it's hazardous for them to sleep, but still they somehow make it through for the most part. Whether it's adaptations or whether they just kind of force themselves to do it, whatever the case is, some people can do it. But if we move, and we know that we're not dealing with the extremes of humanity, we're dealing with all of humanity, if we move our scheduling to more human-centered scheduling, which means scheduling that is more physiologic and takes into consideration some things that we'll talk about in a bit, we may be able to help our residents cope. So one thing that an individual can do is try to figure out how much sleep they actually need, because everybody is different. And we all know these people who sleep 4 hours a night and they're perfectly fine. They're a minority, but they exist. So what they suggest is take a couple of days in your vacation, just sleep as much as you want. So don't count those first couple of days, because oftentimes you may start vacation, I know I do, with a really big sleep lag. And for the first couple of days, you don't really feel human yet. But on day 3, you're going to start feeling normal. And so those next few days, just take a sleep log and log exactly when to go to sleep. You can do this with the Fitbit very well, or any other device that actually tracks your sleep. And then see how long you really do spend sleeping. Calculate the difference, and then, again, how much sleep works for you. You may find that you do tend more towards the 8-hour group, or maybe more towards the 6 or 5-hour group. More things, and I'm sure these are things that most people know, but I think it's important to emphasize with our trainees. The sleep hygiene. Try to keep regular wake times if you can. Oftentimes we can't in medicine. Bedroom for sleep and sex only. Comforting, consistent bedtime routine, whether that's meditation, watching TV, reading a book, video games, whatever the case is. Do what you do and keep it consistent. A lot of this is about conditioning, aerobics, right? So they say no aerobic exercise less than 2 hours before bedtime. I do know people who will come off of an overnight shift and then go to the gym and then go to sleep, and that works for them. So none of these are hard and fast rules, but for most people, the real physical exercise shouldn't happen just before sleep. Keeping a quiet, dark environment, keeping covered in a cool environment, and keep it cool seems to help. Moving the alarm clock out of sight. And this is another interesting one. If you're working nights, right, some people tend to kind of load up on caffeine, and they'll come into the shift, they'll feel okay, so they won't drink it then. But then sometime towards the end of the shift, when things die down, then they're chugging their caffeine and coffee, and they may have another cup for the road before they leave, and then they can't sleep for the next 3 or 4 hours. And so ideally, less than 2 hours before bedtime, you really shouldn't have any caffeine or nicotine. Alcohol is bad as a sleep aid. It is true, it'll make you fall asleep faster, but the sleep architecture is disrupted. You don't get as much of the REM sleep, and so it's not as useful as regular sleep. And if you're not asleep in 30 minutes, they say actually get out of bed. Don't just hang out and linger. Do something relaxing. whether, again, it's your reading, your exercise, cooking something, walking around outside. Sleep aids. It's best not to use them. That's a personal note, but I think also literature supports it just sometimes can become maladaptive. But for short periods, they can help. I'm not going to talk about the pharmacology of all of them right now. I will say that in terms of the complementary and alternative medicine, melatonin seems to be really useful for some people for circadian adjustment. I found, and I've spoken to a lot of our residents, actually the EM residents and the EMI residents, and some of them do use melatonin. Some said, I tried it, it doesn't do anything for me. Others will swear by it. So I think it depends on the dose, depends on how you take it. The important thing with melatonin is take it when you want to go to sleep, because theoretically that'll help trigger or induce the sleep, basically. Kava and valerian are these kind of mild hypnotics that people have used, generally not addictive. Again, generally safe. If people want to try them, it's not unreasonable. So circadian retrainment. This is getting back to a situation where your body is in line with the environment, where your physiology works for your job. Now, what you can do, and this is what a lot of our colleagues do, right? They'll work only nights, or a lot of nursing, for instance, and other staff or receptionists, whenever they'll work only days or only the swing shift. So if you can have that consistent regular shift for a long period of time, your body will re-entrain and you'll be fine. It's still not great. It still does correlate to some medical issues, we think, but overall that's kind of the ideal situation. For ourselves and for our trainees, that's generally impossible because they do have to switch. So if they need to switch, the important thing coming off an overnight, that sun is a very powerful light giver. It's a very powerful time giver that's going to make you kind of wake up and be perky to a certain extent. So sunglasses, avoiding the bright light as much as possible between ending your work and going to sleep can be helpful. Again, maintaining your dark, cool environment, noise machines and all this. Napping before the first night shift is also very important. And this also, again, goes to the point of scheduling. When does our night shift start? Does it start at 5 p.m.? Does it start at 8 p.m., at midnight? Is it easy to nap before then or not? These are things that we have to consider as the people who are deciding and making these schedules, or at least making the framework for the schedules, and encouraging people to nap. I found personally it really helps me a lot. 2 hours of bright light after waking from day sleep. So if you came off that overnight, you slept in the morning, or you slept in the afternoon and you're going to work, to help you get rid of that lag, that momentum, kind of the sleep momentum, you basically 2 hours of bright light will help you get over that. And as I mentioned, melatonin only if you need to, when you're going to sleep, but not before or not too early because it will make you sleepy. Now, sometimes sleep deprivation is unavoidable. This will happen, I imagine, mostly in the surgical specialties where a case comes in, you have to stay, or the case runs late, you have to be there. And so that does happen realistically, or anesthesia perhaps, etc. So if you can limit your time on tasks, so for, again, shift-based specialties, if you can simply focus on one task, do that task, and then rest for a bit and then go back to that task, that may help mitigate the risks. Taking a 15, 20-minute rest break without sleep, just getting out of where you are, just relaxing for a few minutes, doing something else can be very helpful and has been shown to increase and improve function. Napping before or during. Napping and the timing duration is actually very tricky. There's a lot of confusing literature about this, so I think if you are thinking of somehow initiating a napping program or supporting napping within your program, I would look at the literature first, because it depends on how long people are expected to be up. It depends on what kind of tasks they're actually going to be performing. And then caffeine. Caffeine is a great stimulant. People use it. It's more likely to be very helpful in people who are relatively caffeine naive. So if you don't use caffeine frequently, it's probably going to help you more. But even if you do use caffeine, it may help you stay up. It probably will help you stay up. The important thing is, again, not to overdo it and to avoid it towards the end if possible. So I was wondering if there's any thoughts about this. I mean, are these things, again, this comes from airline industry where they're able to be very flexible. Some of these long flights, especially, they'll have like double pilots on. What they were tracking is they're looking at data. They're looking at micro events. How many of these micro naps are these pilots taking? How many times are they falling asleep when they're actually, flying the plane? It's a terrifying thing to read, but it's real and it's very important. There's a lot of, by the way, good literature as well from the trucking industry. There they've also used all kinds of fancy things to look at, their eyes and what are their eyes doing, are they falling asleep, etc. So, anybody have any suggestions? I mean, can we do this? How can we? Maybe the question is different. How can we use these strategies?
What are programs doing in terms of addressing, sleep regularity or deprivation? If you're involved in a GME program or you have faculty who transfer between nights and days, which some programs just have faculty who do that. Has anybody had any thoughts? And even the idea of the work hours changing back for the interns. The new ACGME requirements that are coming into place, right? That's for July.
Well, the next requirements are that they're going, my understanding is that the interns are going to be allowed again to work 24 hours.
Right.
And they're also adding 4 extra hours for like the extra sign-out educational stuff. So the question is, how will that impact us too?
Right. What do people think about interns going back to the 24-hour shift model, if you've seen success with this? Anybody? Any comments? Okay.
So, yeah. So Karen, you're saying you have no intention of going back to the old model. Do you? Can you unmute yourself? Would you mind, like?
No.
Can we do that?
We'll unmute her.
We'll unmute her. Okay.
Karen, for the interns, you're going to keep the model. Has that been a common discussion among the program directors at Northwell to not go back to the old model? You could talk. We unmuted you.
Are you speaking? All right, fine.
What?
Her mic doesn't work.
Karen?
Yeah.
Oh, Karen's mic.
Yeah.
It's not us, it's Karen.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
So this is just something I think program directors are going to have the ability to make individual decisions. My daughter's an intern this year somewhere, and I know they're not going at CHOP, Children's Hospital Philadelphia, and they're not going back to the 24-hour, at least for the coming year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the interesting, the motivating factor behind the change back is that, the switch really hasn't resulted in much improved wellness, and the safety stuff safety data hasn't changed that much. So, the question is, was it worth it? Was it worth switching to a system where people have to be more days? Maybe being more days in the hospital isn't really good for people. Let's see what we have. So Cheryl was saying pediatrics is staying on night shift, and also but changing the weekend schedule. Okay. And then Karen, need to have better strategies to switch from night flow to days though. Right, I completely agree. And if you look at the way to do the switches, it really, I think it may help to have a swing. Going from day to nights is hard, and maybe they're going from, in a swing shift pattern, like an 8-hour pattern might be easier, but you don't want to do something that would increase the handoffs either. Because increasing handoffs, we know, is bad for patient safety, plus probably not as good as a learning experience. But the recovery time is important. I wonder if they have adequate recovery after the nights. So to switch back from days. There's also a question, this doesn't really come up specifically in these articles today, I think, but there's also an issue of, you need kind of the more every time you swing forward, you actually need more than the amount of time you worked for rest. So I know the rules say 12 and 12, but theoretically the better thing physically and physiologically is to go after a 12-hour shift or an 18-hour shift, whatever it is, or 10 hours, to rest for a day if you can, or after a night to have a full day off. So, whether you're working like Tuesday overnight, then not just to have Wednesday off, but also to have that Thursday off. So you need a longer amount of time off, and I don't know if that's realistic. I can talk about why we're changing. Oh, okay. Cheryl, let's see if we can bring Cheryl on. Do you want to tell us how you switch, what you're doing at the weekend? 1 second. There we go. Okay, you're unmuted, Cheryl.
Great. Cheryl?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, so one of the unforeseen, I guess, consequences, I don't know if that's the right word, of going to the full night shift so we've been on night shift for a while, but the interns, because of the 24-hour rule, stayed on through the weekends, whereas the second and third years would do 24-hour calls on Saturdays. So Friday and Sunday would be part of like the week of nights, but Friday and Sunday, but Saturday would be a 24-hour call. So by not having the interns do that, they ended up working more weekends. Like you don't even think about that at the time. So when it came out that interns could do 24-hour calls, our interns were like, oh, you should immediately change them to doing 24 hours on Saturday so they could have more weekends off. So they were more willing to do the 24 hours, even though nobody enjoys doing them, just to have more time away from the hospital with like having more weekends off. So I thought that was an interesting effect of that. And then I wanted to make one comment about what you were just talking about, Dave, with the having the extra day. So for us in the PICU, we still do attendings. We still do 24-hour calls on the weekends. And when we work on Sunday, we're actually allowed to work from home on Tuesday. And that is life-saving. I mean, I personally, when I work 24 hours, I feel okay the next day. I can be up all night Sunday, and Monday, like, I'm fine. I take like an hour or two nap, and I can function. But the Tuesday, I feel like I'm in a fog. So we're allowed to work from home, which makes a really, really big difference. But that's not really going to be feasible probably for house staff.
That's a fascinating idea for you as an attending, that you feel it has such an impact on you physiologically that way.
Yeah, I mean, when we work Saturdays, we come in on Monday, and Monday usually all of us will complain that Monday's like the worst day. You don't feel right. You really don't. It gets worse. Unfortunately, it gets worse as you get older.
But it's true. Like, I worked super hard yesterday, and I don't sleep a lot at night. Like, these numbers of sleep are making me a little scary because I don't sleep a lot, and I feel terrible today. Like, I just feel terrible today, and I did everything wellness-wise that I could. Like, I've been to the gym, I had a good breakfast, I've had too much caffeine already, but just feel terrible. And I know it's because of the hard work yesterday and the repercussion of that, and not taking time off from that, even though it wasn't an overnight shift. It was just too hard yesterday. Yeah. And I feel lousy today, even though I've done some wellness stuff. So it's interesting, and thinking about patient safety, which I'm not impacting, except, I'm driving a car, which if I feel lousy is not good. So I think this is a real issue, thinking about what is the best schedule, and every discipline probably has a different need.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem. It's not a universal answer. And, Karen's response was, oh my, that's not realistic. And so I know, I definitely understand that. And the question is, how do we make it more, how can we support our residents in having a more physiologic schedule? I remember when we switched from because I was a resident at that time, when we went from the Q4 to overnight to the float. And I was actually upset by it, because I'm actually one of those people who's fine with the 24 hours. I don't feel that dead. I don't know about my functioning, but I felt okay with it and actually liked it, because I got kind of this nice day off where I could rest and do my things and run my errands. Whereas a resident, really, you don't have that time, because your days are consumed by your work, which is it's a long work hour week. I mean, listen, 80 hours is crazy. Let's just face it. But so I didn't like that. I didn't like losing my day off. Other people liked it, and I think the trade-off is you're working more days. You're in the hospital more days at a time. So, and Karen, what do you think? Let's see. The institution needs to backfill resident time with more faculty. So that's interesting. More faculty, or I wonder also with mid-levels. What we can do in the emergency department, we have PAs that are, we have PAs and PAs, in the ER we have PAs who are really able to extend us as physicians and residents and allow us not to have to provide as much coverage. Is that something that's realistic for other programs? Can you have
I know the psychiatry emergency room at night now is only staffed by MPs as of midnight.
At Zucker.
At Zucker,
yeah.
as of midnight.
As of midnight.
So the trainees don't have to be there at night.
Right. So is this something at the system, and again, us, as kind of leaders or educational leaders in the system, is something that we have to advocate for within GME as something that impacts our own patient wellness, not patient wellness, but patient safety and resident wellness. I mean, are these things that justify the expense to the system? Is this something that's worth advocating for? Or is there anything more that we can do? I mean, is there anything more that we can do in scheduling to help?
The other concern I have from an education point of view, I'm wondering, with the night float system, so that means if you have 2 weeks of nights or 1 week of nights, I don't know what people do, but that person gets no education sessions for that period of time. And are they so self-directed to make up that? Probably in instinct not. I don't know, motivation-wise, how would they obtain whatever educationally was going on during that time? You could have the leading expert on something coming to speak, and that person doesn't hear it.
Yeah. So Karen's saying it evens out from that perspective because, for all the residents, it ends up being about the same. But on balance, I mean, everybody does lose a little. If there's something you can do at night, some educational programming, or they just stretch too thin anyway. They'll probably stretch too thin to really spend much time on conferences at night. Plus, they're going to be, tired. But the question is, if we do have to do this night float system, which we do for now, do we then, how many nights in a row? I don't remember if this is in any of these articles specifically, but there is some literature to say that, the entrainment, the re-entrainment takes about a week of nights. So if you want to go from days to nights and you want to stay on nights, to get physiologically to a night, it takes a week so that your body switches. But then if you're done with your nights in a week and you go back to days, then you're just screwing yourself because you have to do the whole re-entrainment again and go back to days. So to do one night is generally easy-ish for a lot of people, or 1 or 2 nights. Once you get towards the 4 or 5 or 6 nights, your body starts re-entraining, your body starts realigning, and then it's actually very hard to come back to days. So what a lot of people will say is if you're going to do nights, do nights for 2 or 3 weeks at a time if you can. Again, not always realistic, but physiologically it may be a little bit easier than switching more frequently than that.
What do programs do here? Cheryl, on your night float, is it how long? Is it a week or 2 weeks?
The interns only do a week, but the seniors do 2 weeks. So now that you're saying that, I'm wondering if we should try to change that.
Yeah, I mean, if there's some way for them to do 2 weeks, it's probably going to be easier on them. But then again, it depends, because you may find if you talk to the residents, it was interesting at CORD, so the Council of Residency Directors in Emergency Medicine, just a few weeks ago, they presented one group was talking about how they do their scheduling, and they polled their residents, and they found their residents actually preferred what seemed to be a less physiologic schedule because it ended up giving them more personal flexibility, and again, met their own personal needs. So there's also a balance here of what do they want versus, what physiologically may be a little better, and maybe that doing what's not physiological actually makes them happier.
Right.
Karen's saying they do, night education, which I wasn't aware of. That's nice, and 2 weeks of nights, but no big transition.
So you do night education, with the hospitalist, I'm assuming. Is that correct, Karen? Right? Is it a hospitalist who does the night education?
Nocturnist, yeah.
A
night
nocturnist.
hospitalist, yeah.
Interesting. Which, I don't think that's true across the institution. That certainly may be specific to medicine.
That's what we're doing that on the floors now, because we just, this year, we went to 24/7 pediatric hospitalists. So they have a night curriculum on the floors, but they're also in the PICU and the NICU and the ED. And speaking for the PICU, we don't have the fellows do some teaching when they round, but it's not like completely set in stone. The floors are really the only ones that are doing something relatively fixed.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, listen, the core of medical education ends up, and this is my opinion, ends up being a lot of it is experiential, right? It's kind of like an apprenticeship.
Right. You
see a lot of patients, see the more patients, the better. But to have this additional educational time at night for the people who are missing daytime education is tremendous. I think it's a great opportunity.
Okay. Is there anything on this article?
So we're going to, let's see what we have here. Go ahead.
So with the bibliometrics, I usually like to highlight the social media aspect of the articles that we're speaking about, but as you can see, there's actually no social media mentions of this particular article. And as you'll see for the next article, there weren't, I believe, social media mentions there either. And one of the reasons being is this particular article was published in 2008, which means that Twitter really wasn't, I mean, it was there. It was established in 2006, but it really wasn't as popular as it is today. It's not as embedded as it is today, so it's kind of understandable that it hasn't really been talked about so much. But one thing I do want to mention is that regardless of the social media mentions, it really does have a high citation count. So it's been cited by 45 articles, and it's been saved by 90 readers on Mendeley, which is a bibliographic management system. So that means that people are looking at the article, and given that the content is really a jump-off point in my mind of this particular type of topic, it's understandable that it's been saved on everyone's a large portion of everyone's library, as well as it being cited several times. And this is just a screen capture of the scholarly activity, the Mendeley that I had just mentioned. This breaks down the regions of all the Mendeley readers, as they like to call it, and what region they're from.
So, yeah, just to say, and I realize that this article we just did, the next one we're going to talk about, are a little older. I like them because they are valuable reviews, in a sense, or summaries of the literature. There hasn't been, and there really wasn't even then, a whole lot of work about doctors specifically. For whatever reason, it doesn't seem like we're studying our trainees or the attending physicians and trying out different strategies on them. So a lot of it comes from other industries, which we're kind of borrowing. And maybe if you try this on nurses or on doctors, it won't work. I don't know, but the suggestions are, I think, have value, and again, a starting point for research. So if somebody actually wants to research this stuff, I think it's a good opportunity because there's not too much out there.
So maybe this is a gap in the literature, really trying to understand this for residents or trainees.
Right. What is the best strategy? What,
right.
Sleep-wise, and also, again, there's a lot of smaller articles out there, but nothing very good and very large. So this is another review. This came out of Peds Emergency Care in 2007, Prevention to Treatment of Sleep Deprivation Among Emergency Physicians. And again, even so Douglas Nelson, in his references, also a lot of them come from non-medical sources. So what can we do? And this goes to what we're just talking about, to prevent sleep deprivation and shift lag. So this is the concept I only learned about a few years ago when I was preparing a similar session for the emergency medicine residents. Something called anchor sleep. Some of you may know about this. The idea being, you don't actually need to have, let's say everybody's supposed to sleep 8 hours. You don't necessarily have to have physiologically all those 8 hours at the same time in order to anchor in order to create a physiological anchor. So again, to prevent, now I'm talking a little bit about shift lag or jet lag. So this idea that your body is off kilter from the rest of the world. Working 1 or 2 nights should not cause shift lag if you're mindful of the anchor sleep. What they studied, the 1 or 2 papers I found on this, was really 4-hour periods. But presumably maybe even shorter time is okay, I don't know. But as long as you keep a certain portion of your sleep within your normal sleep time, you can actually anchor physiologically. So your homeostatic mechanisms basically remain on the same orientation. So if you're used to sleeping, for instance, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. every night, and you have to be up one night, if you can nap or sleep for 2 or 3 hours during that 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. or 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., you can actually still maintain your normal cycle without developing that shift, that weird shift, right? So, for instance, in emergency medicine, as it happens, our schedule right now, and this is just accidental, but our night shift actually starts at midnight. So for me, it's tremendous because I can go sleep at about 8 or 9 p.m. and sleep till 10:30 or 11 or so, and I can get almost half a night's sleep in and keep that anchor. So it doesn't really throw me off, and I feel refreshed. Ever since I started doing this and anchoring my sleep, I feel very refreshed before, after my shifts, I should say. I come out, everybody says, hey, how do you look so awake? I'm like, I just slept a couple hours before the shift. So there's a napping effect there too, but part of it is you don't get as much of a jet lag or a shift lag. So then when you want to go to sleep at night again, you sleep a couple hours. This is also a matter of splitting your night. So you do those 3 or 4 hours before the shift, and then after the shift, because it's hard to sleep during the day anyway, sleep another 3 or 4 hours, and then you're great, and you go to sleep at a regular time at night. And you don't have that whole, oh my God, I worked all night, I slept half the day, and now I can't go to sleep at a regular time. This actually prevents some of that. At least it has for me. So there's literature to support it. It seems real from my experience. So shift scheduling, that really can interfere with anchor sleep. So here's how you can think about, can we move our shifts some way to maintain or to protect anchor sleep, or can we schedule napping within a shift? I know the hospitalists do this to a certain extent. At least the internal medicine hospitalists do this to a certain extent, where they will, across their shift, actually have a nap time where they hand off the phone so one isn't covering and the other is, and they cover for each other so they get that nap, but they also can anchor their sleep sometimes during a normal nighttime period. Daytime sleep, like we mentioned, is not as effective and oftentimes shorter because it's just harder. Our physiology isn't pushing us to sleep during the day. That said, you do have a peak of sleep pressure sometime around like the siesta time, so 2, 3, 4 in the afternoon is when the body actually may try to put you to sleep again. So it can be useful to take advantage of that and nap then, even if you can't nap right before your shift. So let's say you have to work an 8 p.m. shift. If you take an hour or 2 nap in the afternoon, that also serves a very important physiologic function. Progressive scheduling we're all familiar with, but when you can do Again, days and then swings and then a recovery of a day or a 24 to 48 hour period, whatever is possible to you. The batching of nights, we talked about it. Again, it's best only to work one shift. If you can, that's not possible for us. So if you're doing, I'm sorry, let's see, we had a question or comment. 1 second. What, hospitalists nap? Oh, they do. I swear they do. They cross cover and they'll rest for like an hour or two. Because there's 2 nocturnists on a night generally. I hope that's not a secret. But we can talk about that offline too. How do we get out of this? Okay. So, but if you have to work nights, there's a few different approaches to it. Isolated night works well, as long as you can, do a little nap before and a sleep afterwards and maintain your normal cycle. If you have to do blocks, anything more than 7 days, like a 2-week block, is probably superior to a 1-week block if possible, because that 1-week switch, like I was saying before, is the entrainment time. And once you're entrained, then you have to re-entrain towards the days. Another interesting thing that some people propose, and it's from this article, is to do shorter shifts during the overnight hours. So if your regular shift, so I know in many specialties where you have to work days and nights, it's different, but where we have an even, so for instance in emergency medicine where the work is more or less steady and we do work like a factory shift worker, when you can do, for instance, like an 8 or a 10 or a 12-hour shift, let's say, during the day, and then a 6 or 8-hour shift at night, it does make life a little bit easier, improves cognitive function, makes it easier to deal with the stress of being at work at night, physiologically. If you can split a night somehow, but again, that requires extra resources for sure, and that's what we discussed about.
But that's where, like, psychiatry does an extender.
Right. So they're not present.
So an MD is present, let's say, from 5 to midnight, and then the extender comes in. So that works. So you have a shorter night shift if you're on night.
Right. So you just kind of have the first part of the night, essentially, and somebody covers the rest of it.
Right.
Right.
That's interesting.
So we've already talked about some of this, actually. I just wanted to show some examples that actually come from a more medical-oriented source, although even then the origins are mostly non-clinical or non-medical references. So I guess, and I know... Yeah.
I have a question for people listening. Do residents complain? I mean, residents complain all the time, but do residents specifically complain about night float versus day float? Do residents really voice an opinion on that, or they just accept the reality?
So Karen, you're saying they do. Do they just not like working nights, or is it an issue where they don't like the way the nights are done, or the burden at night? Issues with sleep. Okay. But go ahead.
So issues of sleep, but, and, also, do they ever complain like that they're there for education, not just service, where at night you really feel like you're providing service because you're saying you have a curriculum at night, but for most places. And, I don't know if anybody's on from surgery could voice any opinion on all of this, because I think surgery was one of the big pushes to go back to the old schedule, that they really felt they lost opportunities with not having the longer days like Q4 or whatever. And I think surgical specialties really wanted to go back to the longer days. Mm-hmm. There was actually a New England Journal article that actually showed that surgeons preferred that, and it didn't change the safety feature.
So Karen's been saying basically the issues of sleep, the travel between shifts. Don't complain about the service part of it and like the autonomy. Cheryl, most of the residents like nights. They feel they have more autonomy.
It's interesting. So this autonomy is interesting because a few of the medical students have said to me, on OB specifically, this is OB specific, they really prefer the nights. They have a week of nights and they would like 2 weeks of nights, because they say there's much more autonomy at night, so they get to do more. I don't know if it's probably true for the residents as well, where they feel during the day they get to do much less. Yeah. So maybe from a training point of view of the experiential learning, you do get to do more, so you learn more that way.
Yeah. Well, Karen's saying that we hover too much during the day. And it's probably true to a certain extent in systems where you days and nights, and maybe the senior faculty and leadership may be around primarily during the day. I know from the emergency medicine there are attendings who prefer to work just nights because senior admin is not there. So they feel like they're not being bothered as much. They feel like they can practice medicine. It's a bit of a different environment actually at night than it is during the day in the hospital. I wonder also, yeah, Cheryl agrees. I wonder also, I see Harley Greenberg's on, in terms of the ICUs as well. ICUs also vary, whether it's the MICU or the SICU or the CCU or whatever. It's a very shift-oriented place, right? The day in the ICU is basically the same as the night in the ICU. Not in terms of the other services around, but in terms of managing a patient. It's a very dynamic kind of environment. So I wonder, the ICU is one place where potentially we could also work on scheduling. I don't know what the medicine residents and how they're doing. I think they have like a swing, right, Karen? The medicine residents in the MICU, they do a morning and then they have a swing and they do nights. Yeah, so they kind of do that. I wonder maybe that, I don't know if they've said anything or whether they feel better doing that versus just days and nights.
Holly, if you're on, do you have curriculum for the people who work nights in the ICU, or they just work and see patients? I would think, for the ICU.
Let's actually step away for another meeting for a few minutes.
Okay, no problem. But I think the ICU is another place where, understanding what's happening in terms of service versus education and nights. That's interesting, right?
Yeah. So Karen's saying it seems like the schedule you're saying, Karen, I guess, was created by the residents for the MICU. So, yeah. And that's another thing, right? So a lot of wellness is, are you empowered, or do you feel like you're being subjected to the powers that be, and are you a victim? So I think the more, if it's possible, to allow people to help design their own schedules or at least participate in the scheduling is probably a useful way to mitigate some of these risks.
Is there anything that could happen to help residents at night? Could there be like, a certain snack that goes around, or, certain, since it's a little quieter at night, I'm not saying for every shift, but things that could happen institutionally by the leadership of the health system at night. I don't know, that would help people who, through the night, if there's anything that could happen.
Yeah.
Alice, that's actually a great idea. We had, sadly this patient passed away recently, but there was a patient who kind of lived in the hospital, and what her family did is they bought like a cart, and she would walk around the hospital, the children's hospital, with her cart of snacks and give them to all of the residents and nurses at night. Like, she'd come around at like 10 o'clock. And even being an attending worked at night, like, looked forward to, oh, Mackenzie's here with her snacks, great. So, like, thinking about it now no one walks around with snacks. So that's actually a great idea, because it was like a moment that everyone would kind of go to this cart and take snacks and talk and take a 5-minute break and then go back to working. It's a good idea.
Yeah.
Right, or, somebody came around and played music at night, or something at night that was a little more stimulating.
Right.
Not lullabies, but, but, music or something came around, or a snack cart or an ice cream cart or something just to mitigate some of the sort of I can't believe I'm working nights routine.
So there's tedium, right? So it's a high stress, by definition, it's a high physiologic stress situation, which is going to probably make you a little bit more higher stress in terms of how you're working, and something to look forward to, something kind of more pleasant during a night shift. That's an interesting idea. And
especially the winter, I think there's a seasonal difference here. If it's so dark in the winter, and depending on that, and it's cold, just now, like when you get up early now, it's light out, it stays light late, there's more hours of daylight. So it's also maybe something seasonal. Yeah. Is there anything on this article? I'm just going to let Wendy go 1 minute, and then we're going to close up.
So very similar to what we were experiencing before, there's no social media mentions of this particular article, but
the age of it.
Because of the age of it. But there are scholarly commentaries as well as blog posts about this particular article. So people are talking about it, not as much as perhaps the previous article, but some of the readers are making a mention. And also, it would be actually kind of interesting to read the blog post. I actually didn't go about and read that post, but that would be an interesting thing to look at. All right.
So I actually want to go back to that, because that's the social media mention. If you see on the right lower corner of the screen where it says scholarly commentary, this is actually a tweet. So I'm not sure why it comes out like that, but it's a tweet from the emergency medicine residency at the Washington University in St. Louis. And if you could see, this goes back to the talk we did last year about social media, but there are hashtags there. So the hashtag, the #EMConf, was actually a hashtag that we had started a few years ago for EM residencies. And it's a way that we all communicate with each other to indicate, hey, this is something important you should look at if you're an emergency medicine physician or a trainee. And so just kind of as an aside, it's always nice to see your work come back to you. But it's just nice to see that tweet. There's a tremendous community online, at least for emergency medicine and critical care. All right,
one more slide.
Yeah, so just to wrap up, I'm hoping that we can, I know there are some barriers, or probably a lot of barriers, but I do think also that we could probably do even just a little bit more to try to change from a system in which we're telling the residents, look, these are the things you need to do to protect your sleep, and these are the things you need to do to show your wellness, to more of like a team-based model where we can say, okay, let's work together. Here are the things that I bring to the table as a program director, as academic leadership. These are things that I can offer you to help with your wellness, or to help with sleeping properly, to help with patient safety. These are things that we can do as a system, and these are the things that you need to do as a trainee. So it's not much of a one-sided conversation. I know many of us do try to do what we can, but I think if it's not seen or presented as, look, we're working on this together, a lot of residents still have that mindset of, this is being done to me and done on me, and so, how does that negatively impact wellness? So,
and some of the older physicians, I think, will feel like we work these crazy hours, not just 24 every Q4. They worked every other, and they still bring this up to people like, you have it so light. Yeah. And I think, I don't think that's helpful at all in terms of role modeling. And the other thing is that most residents have other things going on in their life that cause sleep deprivation besides work,
right,
just due to the age range of residency, be it, children or whatever. So there's other variables that that can't really be controlled for so easily. So I think you can't forget that.
Yeah, and it's not all about reducing hours, because one thing they have shown since reducing the work hours, residents aren't sleeping more. They're not sleeping better. So whether or not they're using the time the way we think they're going to be using the time, or doing other stuff with it, I mean, there's a pressure on residents to get their life done. There's stuff to do in life, and it's just like the thing with healthcare, right? You give somebody insurance for the first time, they become high utilizers for the first 6 months to a year, or whatever it is, because there's an unmet need. There's a pressure. I haven't seen a doctor in 2 years, they need to do all these things. Same thing with residents. You give them more time off, they're going to take care of the things they need to take care of. They don't have enough time. So if we can schedule smarter, but keep the hours whatever way we decide to do the hours, I think we could probably accomplish something there too.
And if we are allowing naps in the hospital, having adequate quarters, because I think that's something that is really poorly attended to.
Right. Well, adequate quarters and coverage. There is, at least at IJ, right, there's call rooms. And they're okay. People sleep in them once in a while. But as a night float resident, or as a resident in the emergency department or in the ICU or wherever, you don't have coverage to take a nap. You have work to do, and that's it. Nobody can cross-cover you. So, and this is to Karen's point, where if the system, if we could have the system somehow provide more support, whether it's an PA who can cross-cover residents while they sleep for an hour or two during a night shift, that would probably go a long way, again, towards patient safety, improving wellness, and preventing the sleep deprivation and the shift lag. So I guess unless we have any further questions, and if you do, please let us know. But we'll be wrapping this up.
One more.
Yeah.
And we will send a Survey Monkey today if you can complete that. Wendy's poster has some nice data about our journal clubs that we use from these Survey Monkeys, aggregate data. So if you could complete this, we'll resume in the fall. I am looking for speakers, so please send the word out wherever you are for speakers. I'd really appreciate it. And you can do articles that you're interested in. And thank you.
Thank you, everyone.